Welcome back to our monthly series with Greg McGeorge from JMI Wealth. Greg has over 35 years of experience in financial markets, both here and in London, and JMI Wealth manage over $6 billion in investments. This month, Greg is going to be talking about the movement of raw materials around the world and how a small group of commodity traders control that flow. If you want to chat more with Greg about your investments or the market in general, or you'd like to sign up to his weekly newsletter, you can find him at jmiwealth.co.nz. Greg, I've always assumed that a commodity producer like Saudi Arabia would simply sell their oil to BP, and that was that.
Yeah, you're right, and that used to be the case, and there still is a little bit of that, and especially for a commodity like oil. In fact, initially there was a group called the Seven Sisters. Now, the Seven Sisters controlled production, they controlled delivery, refining, they controlled the consumption, and of course, they controlled the price. So the Seven Sisters were made up of the Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, Texaco and Gulf. But by the 1980s, oil producers had nationalized their production. However, now these oil producers needed help to sell their product to the global market. And this is where the commodity traders really came into their own. The traders were able to access a wider range of buyers for the oil producers. They provided logistics. They even provided financing for countries that perhaps couldn't afford to buy the oil. And if the oil producer perhaps wanted to deal with a counterparty that they didn't traditionally like to deal with, the brokers were a great intermediary to solve that problem for them. So in terms of my experience in the commodities market, I've come across commodities through the highly regulated futures exchanges. So that's where you can buy everything from your base and precious metals through to agricultural products like wheat and corn and your energy products like oil and natural gas. But everything about these contracts is highly standardized and highly regulated, right from the quantity and quality of the product to the actual delivery date and expiration date of the contract, and even where you are allowed to store the product. It's highly regulated. But because of those standardized contracts, it's really easy to get in and out of the market and trade, and really importantly, price transparency is there for everyone. But the market for the movement of raw materials around the world is controlled by just a handful of global players, and they're pretty much a law unto themselves. So they act as intermediaries between the producers and the consumers, and depending on who is selling or buying, they can pretty much dictate the price without transparency. They have, for example, bought oil to resell to countries that under embargoes. They very much like to stay out of the limelight, and usually for very good reason. But for some reason, they've been grabbing lots of headlines of late, and not for good reasons. There just seems to be scandal after scandal when it comes to the movement of these raw products around the world. This market is often described as the last bastion of capitalism.
So, Greg, you mentioned that they like to stay out of the limelight, but yet they still have this outsized influence in global affairs. How are they so influential?
Well, they have such influence that you could argue that without these commodity traders, petrol stations would run out of petrol, factories would grind to a halt, bakeries would run out of flour. The commodity traders control the flow of the world's strategic resources. And that's made them powerful relationships within the political arena as well. So what they do is they'll sign up countries or companies with contracts to supply them with whatever commodity they require. And these contracts can just be for a one-off shipment of whatever product, or they can be for a 10-year supply agreement. So to give you an idea, the leading agricultural traders handle just under half of the world's grain and oil seeds, while the largest metals trader handles a third of the global supply of cobalt. And likewise, the largest traders control about a quarter of the flow of energy products around the world. But the interesting thing is, though, they're primarily a marketeer. They have very few, if no, production assets of their own, but they're incredibly good at developing strong relationships with the countries in particular that are producing the raw material to ensure that they have ongoing access to supply. And these relationships they have, they include heads of states, government officials, diplomats. That's the world they work in. And there are many examples where they've successfully navigated these complex political landscapes and managed to secure, surprise, surprise, very profitable deals for themselves. Whether that be supplying oil to South Africa during the UN embargo in the 1960s, or helping Iran sell their oil on the global market during a similar embargo in 1979. So they're there in the background, ensuring that the commodities do flow regardless of international sanctions or political tensions. As I said earlier, they very much operate in the shadows. They're leveraging those networks and their expertise to bypass restrictions and to really facilitate transactions that potentially probably could never, ever have happened.
Okay, so they're incredibly powerful. They operate in the shadows. I'm not sure of their morality. Could you tell me what are perhaps some of their greatest or perhaps worst trades or trade stories?
Yeah, I'm guessing which side of the deal you're on. One of the classics has to be what's now referred to as the Great Grain Robbery. So back when the Soviet Union was around, Soviet Union crops failed in the early 1970s. And fearing a famine, the Soviet Minister for Agriculture jumped on a plane, went to America, approached all the top grain commodity traders, and started buying up grain in bulk. So obviously the traders saw an incredible opportunity to make money, and they helped facilitate the sale of something like $1 billion in grains, and this is back in the 70s. So they were buying as much as they possibly could from the American producers. So the traders were successful in acquiring the grain they needed to sell to the Soviet Union. But what most people at the time didn't realize was the sheer enormous size of the order. In fact, the deal was so large, it ended up accounting for something like 25% of America's total grain storage. So the sheer size of the contract meant that there was actually a shortage of grain in the US, and subsequently globally, because now America didn't have any spare capacity to export. So the resulting global grain shortage caused this spike in inflation. To give you an idea, food component of the CPI jumped to about 20%. There were other things that were going on in the global economy at the time, but that food inflation spike was certainly a contributing factor to the recession, global recession that actually followed. And you would have thought this incident would sort of send alarm bells off in governments around the world, that maybe we should be looking at these traders a little bit more closely. We should be looking at regulations. But there wasn't. And this particular Great Grain Robbery is often cited as the pivotal moment in history where people really started to understand or didn't understand the power that these traders had through political connections and what they can actually do to the economies.
You mentioned at the start that there's been a more spate of more recent cases. Can you tell me more about them?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's incredible. More recently we've had everything from bags of stones being stored in warehouses that were being used as security to underpin contracts and financing instead of the actual nickel that should have been there. So last year, one large trading firm bought a cargo that was supposed to contain tin concentrate, but turned out to be full of sand when the ship docked. December, just last year, one of the biggest traders in the world was left facing more than $500 million in losses after a cargo it bought didn't contain the nickel it was supposed to. So when they bought the nickel, the ship was already at sea. They then on-sold it while it was still at sea, and it was only when the new buyers went to inspect the commodity, not there. It was a much lower value commodity. Now, so the traders were taking the loss on that one. August 2022, group of traders discovered the copper that had been used as collateral for a rather large loan actually only turned out to be a third of the volume that they thought was meant to be there. The rest had already been sold by the owner. There's plenty of examples where fictitious quantities of aluminium were used once again as collateral for loans. So, and then you add to all that other things that can go wrong in the market, like phantom cargoes, ghost ships. So a phantom cargo, right, is when the ship arrives at port with little or none of the commodity, and ghost ships are basically where the boat leaves with the commodities on it, disappears, and turns up at somewhere completely different, and surprise, surprise, nothing on it. I think Venezuela might have been involved in a lot of that. And there's also lots and lots of stories coming out about what's referred to as double financing. So that's whereby the owner of the commodity pledges it as security multiple times to different lenders. As I said earlier, it's an extraordinarily opaque market with little or no regulations.
Yeah, sounds like the Wild West or like
Correct.
Great heist movies.
I know. If you've got the networks, the connections, as I said at the start, it is the last bastion of pure capitalism.
Yeah. Now, just before we went on air, Greg told me a fascinating story. Can you? Maybe don't mention the country names or the cargo.
Yeah, okay. So yes, there was a country bought a cargo of energy product which they needed desperately for their country. The ship was sailing quite happily, had the transponder on, so the country was going, yeah, here it comes, thank you. The contract price had been fixed just before Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, as soon as Russia invaded, the price of this commodity spiked. So the traders were going, ooh, we've got these buyers somewhere else in the world who are happy to pay us 4 times that. They literally turned the boat around and sent it off to this other country.
Because this country had potentially worse contracts, so they thought, we can get out of this one.
Correct. So they didn't have the most binding contracts. And the traders were sort of saying, well, it's their own fault as well, because when this country had bought, in previous years, when the price was this high, and then the price had collapsed, they had tried to renegotiate and play hardball to get the lower price. So their argument was, well, careful what you wish for. You wanted to play hardball, well, so can we. And they didn't have their energy product to run their country.
And so what was the net result to that quite large country?
Exports over the next little while slumped 20%. Energy was rationed. People only got electricity for a few hours a day. Yes, it had a massive impact on the country's financial well-being, and obviously the individuals. Right? Yeah, absolutely. The power of commodity traders.
Yeah. So, Greg, other than the fact that this seems like they're a law unto themselves, why is this happening?
Well, for all the high-tech wizardry we have in financial markets these days, and it is everywhere, but for some reason the commodity world still depends almost entirely on bits of paper, which obviously can make it incredibly easy for fraud. So, in particular, buyers and sellers of base metals use documents known as warehouse receipts to prove the commodity exists and who owns it, while all oil traders rely on something similar, but it's called a certificate of quality and quantity. So these receipts and certificates have become the linchpin as well for bank loans. Banks thinking that these bits of paper are good for it, so happy to lend the money. But like most pieces of paper, warehouse receipts and certificates can be faked. And there are signs that more and more lenders are being ripped off through this type of financing, where loans are secured by commodities that don't actually exist, and the same as I talked about earlier, double financing. And the reason is there's no central tracking system for financing, so you can't actually register your interest over the commodity. That same commodity could change hands several times while it's still at sea, so it's incredibly difficult to track who owns it or where it is. I talked about the ship changing course, because the commodity on board was sold to another country. So it seems to be a case until that ship arrives in port and the goods are unloaded and inspected, you can't be guaranteed what you'll receive, or even if you're going to receive anything at all. Now, there are moves to bring commodity trading into the 21st century, with plans for transactions to be held on a blockchain that would obviously improve the way ownership is verified. And likewise, any attempt to alter an invoice or use a document more than once for double financing would be obvious to all participants. The potential benefits of the technology is undeniable. Reduced fraud, increased efficiency, improved traceability. It's a regulator's dream. However, the transition isn't likely to happen anytime soon. There's a massive amount of work globally, different jurisdictions, different legal matters, frameworks to work on. So it's not happening anytime soon. So no one has to worry. There's still plenty of time to enjoy the golden age of paper trails and plausible deniability before blockchain brings its sobering transparency to the colourful world of trading commodities. So hopefully we're still going to get some fun stories about pebbles and sands turning up where they shouldn't be.
Totally. Amazing. Thank you. Thanks for that.